Let's talk about scaling up and scaling out with cloud. Pierre, what do you see today with public cloud?
Well, there's different adoption patterns for the cloud. There are some that are scaling out to the cloud for resiliency, and there are some that are scaling out to the cloud for availability and growth. There are some that are moving to the cloud because they're losing their on-prem data center. Maybe they've acquired a company and they don't want to use both data centers, so they want to consolidate. And there are some that are just going to cloud because it's a new company, it's a new initiative, and instead of building it on-prem and then moving into the cloud at a later date, they decided to just move it to or build it on the cloud right away.
Do you see specific types of workloads working better in the cloud versus on-prem?
Yes, there are a number of segments that work better in the cloud. So anything that is stakeholder focused. So if your audience is out in the wild, then doing cloud, because you can reach multi-geography, you can reach your stakeholders wherever they are and provide them the best experience in terms of latency. So if they're in Europe, they're going to hit a data center in Europe. If they're in North America, they're going to hit a data center in North America. So if it's outward facing, then it's best in the cloud. If it's internal facing, then you have to ask yourself, is it internal facing in one location? Is it internal facing in multiple locations? If you're moving applications into the cloud and you want to take advantage of scaling and growth, is the application you're moving into the cloud built to support multi-instance and dynamic growth and dynamic scaling out and scaling in? So these are all discussions that you really have to have with your management and with your developer and your the owners of these applications, because you could really paint yourself into a corner if you're taking the wrong approach based on the application you're trying to move to the cloud.
Got it. And do you happen to see verticals that are more inclined to adopt cloud versus others?
Well, commercial, number one, is more inclined to go to the cloud, mostly because they have less of a compliance issue with cloud. So if you're looking at government or healthcare or financial, now there is some added compliance issues that they need to consult with their lawyers and their legal departments in order to figure out what they need to do in order to get to the cloud. Because of course, the cloud has got all the compliance requirement. However, the tools are there. It's whether or not you apply them to your own deployment. Mm-hmm. So those ones are a little slower, but they're very big, so they are looking at it. So anybody that wants to have competitive advantage goes to the cloud. New companies don't invest in on-prem as much because they see the benefit of the economies of scales that you can get by building directly on the cloud. Commercial, because of the fact that you can reach your audience so much quicker, is adopting the cloud very, very quickly.
Okay, that makes sense. And so, if I go back many years, I think back to when virtualization first came out, when you had VMware and Hyper-V, and everybody was like, "Oh no, I'm not going to give up my physical servers."
It's working just fine. Exactly. I'm never going to move that up. Yes,
exactly. And so, give it a few years, and then you have most workloads are virtualized, and I think we've seen kind of the similar type of behavior and trend with cloud. Yep. Initially it was typically more the larger enterprises, or like you said, kind of the organizations that were cloud first,
yep.
That were early adopters, and the rest of the folks were like, well, I've already got such an investment in my data center, or no, I just prefer, because as an IT engineer, is the cloud going to take my job away? Is that something I have to worry about? And I think as people got over those concerns and fears and saw all the greatness that cloud can provide and bring to the table, that more folks are starting to become, much more open-minded to it, and we're seeing become much more mainstream.
Well, if you're worried about, is the cloud going to take my job away, which is a completely separate discussion, if your only job is to rack servers, then maybe. Anything else, you will adapt, because networking, you still have to be able to manage your networking, monitor it, scale it properly. Your VMs, your IaaS, your PaaS, your security, your identity, all of that still needs to be managed, and still needs to be managed by IT professionals.
Exactly. And even though, there's somebody that's actually, making sure that the equipment is plugged in and racked and all that good stuff in the data center, in the cloud's data center, you still have to monitor it. And so
Absolutely.
There's still a lot of the similar challenges that, and types of work that you would do on-prem that you still have to do in the cloud.
Absolutely.
So you talked about how every workload is not truly primed for the cloud. Some should remain on-prem. So data centers aren't going away.
Not anytime soon.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe in the future, but not anytime soon.
Yeah.
And so with that the case, as we talked about, kind of cloud is now becoming more mainstream and more the norm. And so with that being the case, what type of challenges do you see typically in working with customers as they start kind of the migration and transition to the cloud journey?
Well, in terms of migration is picking the right application, as we talked about already, to move to the cloud. Some companies are always going to have their crown jewel that is not going to see the cloud, mostly because it's either sensitive, compliance, or many other reasons where those applications are not going to go to the cloud. So they still have to manage that. So now they end up with, in a lot of cases, dealing with deciding within, do I have two separate sets of tools to manage my growth, my scale, one for the cloud and one for on-prem? How do you turn your mindset to start using, even if sometimes you have to leave the tools that you're using on-prem, to adopt something that will do both on-prem and in cloud, so that you get the benefit of, for example, like Azure Monitor, where you can monitor all the VMs that are in your cloud, but also you can monitor all of the telemetry and performance metrics from your machines that are on-prem. So there's a shift in how you're using the tools, what tools you're using, how you build it in your mind as to connecting those two environments together so they actually work together well. Are you connecting multiple data centers to the cloud using ExpressRoute, using site-to-site VPN, or are you completely disconnected and just doing point-to-site VPN when needed? These are all questions that you need to answer before you start scaling up to the cloud. Once you get in the cloud, again, not every application is going to be a good candidate to scale out for growth. If you have an application that doesn't work and you scale to multiple instances, well, maybe those instances are going to conflict with each other when they're talking to the back end. Where do you want the back end? You want the back end as a PaaS, which is a little cheaper, easier to manage because you don't have to worry about the infrastructure underneath. Do you want it on a VM in Azure, or do you want it in a VM or on a physical machine inside your own data center because of threats or because of compliance? So there's all these questions. So you need to understand very, very deeply how your own line of business application, commercial application, whatever they are, workloads, all those workloads, how they work together, how they're worked within each workload, and how you can optimize it properly. And then once you've got that inventory and you figure out what are the low-hanging fruit that you can move to the cloud, then you can start the migration of application. On the other end, the cloud, even though if you don't move any applications, which is possible in some environments, while there are some cloud services, and that will allow you to have some benefits on-prem, backup, patching, monitoring, all these things where you don't have to deploy your own infrastructure to support that service because that service is now being optimized for you.
Exactly.
So there's low-hanging fruits. There's applications that will move very easily. There's applications that will move a little bit more slowly. It's all a matter of how well you understand your own environment.
And the infrastructure and the application and what are all the pieces and components that make it up?
Absolutely, and all of that works together. It's like a giant puzzle with squiggly edges. You have to make sure that all the pieces fit well together.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of it has to deal with planning. Understanding what you have in your environment, and then, like you said, kind of targeting, okay, these are the workloads that make the most sense to move over.
That's
Let's
right.
figure out how we're going to phase that and actually make that a reality.
And moving a workload up to the cloud, if you're moving something from VM to VM, some VM to IaaS, infrastructure as a service, you may not see the financial benefits that a lot of the marketing tells you.
Okay.
Because that's step one. Because at that point, you're basically hosting that application in a cloud service. There are some availability benefits to it, but you're really not using native cloud solutions. So they won't automatically scale easily.
Then you can optimize it further then.
But then that's like step one. Move it because maybe you're losing your data center. Maybe something else. That might be other drivers that are pushing you to move that application there. And then once it's there, then you start modernizing it. So go from a Apache or IIS web server to a web app. So now you don't have to worry about patching that machine, monitoring that machine. Now you just have to worry about the application. Yep. Your database can still be on the VM, it can still be on-prem. It's just a matter of switching the connection string.
Yeah.
So you move one piece at a time. If you try to move too much at the same time, then you paint yourself into a corner, and then you're all going to have a hard time getting to where you want to go.
Got it.
So understanding what you're moving or what you want to move, how it fits within the greater environment, and what makes sense at the time. And of course, it always has to have a business value. If you're just moving to the cloud because you think it's cool and you want to be trendy, great. However, that's not going to give you the ROI that you're looking for.
Exactly. So you already talked about hybrid a little bit and specific, workloads that make sense to be in the cloud and the back end, for example, being on-prem. And so when you talk about hybrid specifically, what about in the scenario where, let's say it's a finance application, yep, and it's at the end of the month is when you need really the horsepower in order to crunch all the numbers and do all the aggregation, but you don't need it the rest of the month. How do you handle that in that situation?
Well, scale or usage typically is in cycles. Mm-hmm. The same scenario at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter, where it used to be you tell them, your accounting department, you're not allowed to do any work for the next 3 days because we need to be crunching numbers. Yep. So you have this on-prem, this massive infrastructure of hardware and software that is designed for that peak, but for most of the month is not being utilized. So you're paying for something you're not using.
Yeah, you're overinvested.
Yeah. So if you move that to the cloud, for example, within a maintenance window before that crunch happens, you can easily scale up that VM. So take that VM, shut it down, assign a larger family of VMs, so more cores, more memory, more horsepower to that VM, spin it back up, run through your crunch, which instead of being 3 days might end up being overnight. And then the next morning, you shut it back down, you bring it back down to a regular size VM, and then you spin it back up. So it's usable all month, but then you have access to the horsepower when you need it. That is if that application can't scale out. So that's what we call scaling up, adding more resources to an existing machine. That's scaling up. Scaling out is if that application actually is multi-instance aware. That's what I was talking about earlier when we say be very conscious of how your application behaves and how it runs. Mm-hmm. Now, if it supports multi-instance, then you can dynamically grow it, meaning when it hits a certain level, whether it's CPU, whether it's memory, whether it's network, there's all kinds of different metrics that you can monitor. When you hit a certain threshold, then increase it by 2 instances. And if the threshold keeps going up or the usage keeps going up, then you add 2 more instances. So you can start with 2 instances. So 2 is always a good number. Not 1 actually is the best number. Mm-hmm. So you don't have a single point of failure. And then you can grow to 4, 6, 8, 10, 20, 100. To take advantage of the load that you're doing. But when it's done, then those instances are being shed. So you're only paying for the horsepower you need when you need it.
Got it.
So that's what we call scaling out.
Okay.
It's a lot easier to scale out and scale in when the application is built for it, mm-hmm, when it's in a PaaS situation, for example. If you're doing that in an IaaS situation, infrastructure so if you're doing that with a VM, mm-hmm, that means you have to install your application on a VM, make sure that VM is now generalized, and you capture an image, and then you deploy it in a scale set.
Yep.
So when you need a new instance, it'll copy the image, spin up a new image, but it takes longer. Mm-hmm. So it's longer to ramp up, it's longer to ramp back down, but you end up with the same, in the end,
results,
but with a lot more management headaches.
Yeah, it's not as elastic.
It's not as elastic.
Got
It's
it.
still possible, but with a lot more thought into it and a lot more processes built into it. Plus, if you're scaling out VMs, now you have to start managing and monitoring more VMs.
Exactly.
So it all comes down to that life cycle, application life cycle wheel where you deploy, you monitor, you adapt, and then you redesign, and then you deploy, you monitor, you adapt, and so on.
So we talked a little earlier about monitoring and whether you have infrastructure on premises or it's in the cloud. You can actually deploy, a monitoring solution for your on-prem and a monitoring solution for your cloud, or look for one that does both. But when you're actually moving workloads from on-prem to the cloud, whether it's full or it's in a hybrid fashion, you want to make sure that you can actually measure it and prove to the business and your users that it had the desired impact, whether it be better performance or better throughput and response time. But how do you measure that effectively?
Well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of a single pane of glass to measure everything. So if your existing tool doesn't see the cloud, for example, then you got to look at something that will complement that, because you don't want to have any dark spots. That's number one. Number two is once you move an application and start measuring, you got to start by knowing exactly what you're going to be measuring to make sure that it actually meets your requirements. Mm-hmm. So if you're measuring latency, where are you measuring the latency? Are you measuring it at the application gateway? Are you measuring it at the server? Are you measuring it at the database in terms at the end of the transaction? Like, are you measuring for the benefit of the stakeholder that's connecting and using your service? Or are you measuring for internal, make sure that the inside of your application is working correctly? Mm-hmm. So that's a decision that has to be made. And then your monitoring solution will have to be designed to meet what that expected threshold is. That being said, your application, when you're looking at cloud, for example, we have all of the telemetry for all of the resources that you have in the cloud. It's all available to you. It's how you consume it. If you're scaling out and scaling in based on the certain metrics that you're not measuring correctly, mm-hmm. then your scale out and scale in is not going to represent what you want to actually happens. If your tool has a blind spot and you don't see it, again, you're going to not have the performance or not have the end result that you're looking for. So it's very important to pick a tool that measures what's important to you, and you have to decide what's important to you with a clear vision as to what you're measuring it for. Is it for the stakeholder at the other end, or is it for internal usage of these resources that you have? So there are many, and is 80% CPU usage what you're gunning for, or is it 60? Because if you're scaling in and out at 60, mm-hmm. then that means that at any given time, you're basically throwing away 40% of the compute power you're using. So that monitoring is very, very important, but it's only there to drive what your end results want to be.
Got it. So one of the things that I kind of take away from this conversation today is that planning is critical to do up front. Understanding, what applications you have first, and then, how those applications are built and architected. Are they something that is actually ripe and prime to actually move to the cloud and take advantage of those cloud services that are available, whether it's platform or it's infrastructure? Having a clear understanding and visibility into that is something that's important.
Yeah, it's really key to understand what you have, where you want it, and how you measure success. That dictates the approach you're going to take, how you're going to measure it, what you're going to measure, at which point, and it basically opens the door that once you're successful on one workload, you can start looking at the other workload. What is the next low-hanging fruit? So I'm really glad that point came across.
Yeah, and so at the end of the day, the reality is there's no silver bullet when it comes to migrating to the cloud.
There really isn't.
So again, it's been enlightening and great to have, a cloud expert such as yourself, Pierre, here to kind of talk with folks about, the challenges and the what you take into consideration as you start to scale up and scale out with the cloud.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. It's really great to work with partners that ensure basically the success of all